Hello and welcome. In this video I'm going to be reflecting about the election that is due to take place in the UK in the second half of 2024 and which must take place no later than the 28th of January 2025. Having secured a majority of 80 in 2019, inflicting the worst defeat on the Labour Party since 1935 in terms of the number of seats won, Boris Johnson seemed to be in an unassailable position, with many commentators sagely predicting that Labour faced a near impossible hurdle at the next election and that Johnson's Conservative Party might dominate the political scene for a decade or more. Johnson's victory should not be understated, and neither should Labour's defeat. Following their defeat in 2019, Labour would need a swing equivalent to 1997 to win a majority of just one seat, and they faced a huge structural barrier to victory, having been dislodged from their heartlands in Scotland in 2015 and in the so-called Red Wall in 2019. The Conservative Party also benefited from a media landscape in the UK where the media narrative tends to be driven by a print media that is dominated by the right-wing press. This creates an environment in which the Conservatives seem to play politics on easy mode, whilst the Labour Party see the media as a structural constraint, denying them the agency of setting out a bold policy agenda out of office because they fear how this will be written up in the press. It is this dynamic that has structured our politics since the election, as the Labour Party was taken over by Keir Starmer, who seemed to offer Corbynism without Corbyn in the Labour leadership election, but who has led the party away from this position in order to offer competence and moderation to the British people, without seeming to offer much in terms of policy for the Conservative Party or the press to attack as we approach the election. But moderation and competence alone would not have delivered much. Starmer's strategy could only succeed if the Conservative Party failed in office so badly that the press would turn on them. And in this they had reliable enemies in Boris Johnson, Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak. At first Johnson's premiership seemed to be going well, bolstered by his victory in 2019 and by the delivery of Brexit on the 30th of January 2020. But the Johnson government was soon to face a crisis that exposed the weaknesses of Johnson's character. Although many would criticise Johnson's handling of the pandemic, as it revealed a man who didn't have a grip on the detail and who dithered when decisive decisions were needed to prevent an exponential rise in infections and therefore deaths. It wasn't his decision-making during the pandemic that led to his downfall. In fact, as the COVID death toll in the UK surpassed 100,000, the front pages of the right-wing press encouraged readers to sympathise with Johnson, a fantastic illustration of the power of the press and how this can shape a media narrative. The wheels came off for Johnson over the fact, now established by a police investigation, that pandemic rules were not being followed in Number 10 during the pandemic. In fact, the culture was so bad in Number 10 that a suitcase full of wine was wheeled in when staff ran out of booze on the eve of the Duke of Edinburgh's funeral, timing that would highlight the juxtaposition of staffers revelling in Downing Street as the Queen sat alone, mourning the death of her husband, wearing a black mask over her face. But it was not the events themselves that would sink Johnson. Like Nixon with Watergate, it was the lies and the deceit that followed, which was skillfully exposed in Parliament by the loyally Keir Starmer at Prime Minister's questions. As the Conservatives began to sink in the polls, and facing an inquiry into his conduct by the Privileges Committee by Parliament, his party started to turn against the Prime Minister, fearing that he was leading them into electoral defeat. The final nail in the coffin for Johnson was his failure to dismiss Chris Pincher from his role as Deputy Chief Whip, despite being aware of accusations of sexual assault. This triggered a crisis in Johnson's government, with a record 57 government resignations, placing Johnson in a position where he couldn't staff all of the positions in his government and was therefore forced to resign. This led to a leadership election which Liz Truss won by appealing to the party membership with a neo-Reaganite vision centred around committing to massive unfunded tax cuts that she argued would lead to economic growth. In the end, when her Chancellor implemented the mini-budget, which committed to unfunded tax cuts totalling $175 billion over 5 years, the bond markets in the UK went into freefall, driving up interest rates and prompting the Bank of England to intervene. This created an immediate crisis, which Truss tried to stem by sacking her Chancellor, but she was forced to resign just 50 days into office after the chair of the 1922 Committee of Conservative backbenchers privately told her that she did not have the support of the parliamentary party and would have to resign. This led Rishi Sunak to become leader of the Conservative Party and Prime Minister in October 2022 after an uncontested leadership election. His rise to power deserves a video of its own because it's difficult to explain how a man who only entered Parliament in 2015 and who only served as a junior minister in the Treasury for 7 months under Boris Johnson ended up being promoted to Chancellor of the Exchequer and then became Prime Minister. I can't think of a more meteoric rise, and it highlights the importance of ministerial office as a testing ground for leadership. The truth is that Sunak was a relatively unknown quantity, and he has proven to have poor political instincts, which have led him to move from one half-baked political strategy to another, without providing the country with a clear sense of what he stands for or why he is seeking re-election. And so we find ourselves in a situation where the Conservative Party are staring down the barrel of defeat at the next election, largely because of their own incompetence in government. So how bad can it get for the Conservative Party at the next election? Let's start with the worst case scenario. The polling for the Conservative Party is worse than in the run-up to the 1997 election, because the gap between the two parties is equivalent, but the popularity of the Conservative Party is much lower now than it was then, with the party not polling 30% or more in any poll since October 2023, and now polling less than 25% more often than not, and sometimes polling as low as 19%. The trend in polling has also been broadly trending downwards throughout the Parliament, and so it's not clear what the floor is for their support, or that Sunak's strategy of delaying the election will make things better rather than worse. In fact, it's a horrible thing to say, but in an era where political sentiment is increasingly predicted by age, and the Conservative electorate is therefore getting older, it's worth pointing out that 1 in 10 Conservative voters have died since the last election, and this demographic shift means that time is probably not on the side of the Conservatives, as younger people enter the electorate by turning 18 every day, and older voters leave the electorate. The party are also facing the threat of a resurgent party on the right in the form of Reform UK, which ran as the Brexit Party at the last election. Their support in polls is trending upwards, and they're now achieving poll ratings of between 10 and 16%, which is disproportionately eating into the Conservative vote. The polling website Electoral Calculus are now predicting 90 seats for the Conservative Party as their central prediction, and this is supported by large-scale MRP polls, with those released this year predicting the party will get somewhere between 80 and 169 seats. To put this in context, the Conservatives won 165 seats in 1997, so the polling evidence is largely supporting the view that the Conservative Party will do worse than in 1997, and this is before factoring in the likely impact of tactical anti-Tory voting at the election, all of which could reduce the party to a rump and might make Ed Davey the leader of the opposition. So what about the best case scenario for the Conservative Party? I hate resorting to political cliches because the fact that something has happened in the past is not a reliable judge of the future, but it is true to say that polls usually narrow during an election campaign, and the Conservative Party might therefore think that it can improve its poll ratings during the campaign by squeezing the Reform UK vote. The Conservative Party are likely to employ a strategy similar to the strategy used by John Major in 1997, which was to warn of the dangers posed by a Labour government. This might help them to narrow the gap, especially as the electorate are increasingly volatile and have shown a tendency to make up their minds about how to vote later than was the case in the past. But the fact that Sunak is facing the Labour Party of Keir Starmer means that the policy offer from Labour won't be that radical, so the opportunity to attack them will be reduced. Sunak does benefit from facing a Labour Party that is afraid of its own shadow, led by a leader who is regarded by the electorate as dull and perhaps even a bit dishonest. But Starmer's weakness as a politician simply doesn't matter as much in an election that will be won by Labour because the overwhelming sentiment in the country is that the Tories need to go. This leads me to finish by making a foolish prediction, which is that I think that the Conservative Party will have a worse election than in 1997, with the party facing a real risk of being reduced to a rump after factoring in declining poll ratings and the likely effect of anti-Tory tactical voting. This will put Labour in an incredibly strong position in Parliament, with acres of political space to make real and lasting change, an opportunity they must not squander, because an electoral coalition that vote for a party largely because they don't like the other guys is quite a fickle group of voters. As this election cycle has proven, A strong election victory can make a party or a prime minister think they're invincible, but this is never really the case. The next Labour government will only solidify their power by doing what Margaret Thatcher managed to do in 1983. She was able to exploit divisions from her opponents and created a set of voters who could point to policies that had materially benefited their lives. This is what Labour must now do, because their failure to do so risks opening the door for the right in 2029, however big a mandate they win this time around. I hope you've enjoyed the video, whether you agree with my analysis or not. This is part of a series of videos about general elections, which I hope you will share with others who might be interested. If you find my analysis interesting, don't forget to like and subscribe, and whatever you think of what I've said, let me know in the comments. For now, goodbye and best wishes.